From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. In this episode, which we call High, Wide, and Handsome, we're focused on the accomplishments in Montana during this era of progressive change that relate to the land, to the water, to the air, to the basic nature of Montana in terms of environmental change and progress that was shown on that field during the 1970s. We are joined by two extraordinary Montanans. We're blessed to have them here with us today. They started out as new kids on the block together in 1971 in the legislature when they were both freshmen. And that is Bob Brown. Bob, 26 years in the Montana legislature, right. 4 in the House, 22 in the Senate, right. 4 years as Secretary of State, and then you were a nominee for governor for the Republican Party. Dorothy Bradley. Dorothy came in 1971, the same time Bob did, and over a period of, had 16 years in the legislature, broken by a period in there where she was doing a few other things. That being said, between 1971 and 1993, you had 16 years in the Montana legislature. You also were a nominee of the Democratic Party for governor. These folks here, I'm so honored to have you with me, I remember went from, as I say, new kids on the block to prominent state leaders. And we're honored to have you, here with us today on In the Crucible of Change. So, now, to that idea that you came in together in 1971, that wasn't happenstance, really. When we sat down and talked with Dorothy Eck, and had a wonderful program with her, she spoke about the two of you emerging from Bozeman's Earth Day activities in the spring of 1970. I wondered if you might move on that and talk a little bit about how did that all happen? What was going on? You just came back from education in Colorado and then overseas, back to your home of Bozeman. You were from the Flathead, right. But you were the president of Montana State University student body, weren't you? Mm-hmm. So did you get engaged in Earth Day? Fire away.
I will start out with that because I was a sort of wild, crazy person, where Bob was more traditional student body president, really respectable. And there we came out of the chute together and loving every minute of it. I'm a lifelong Bozeman person, and I did come home from Germany right after college. I'd been working over there. My mother was ill, and I came back to Bozeman and got captivated with the whole Earth Day movement. We were allowed to have a little closet on the MSU community student offices, thanks to Bob, and we put together a huge Earth Day event. It was the very first Earth Day, April 1970, ever. Yeah. Led by Gaylord Nelson. Mm-hmm. I sometimes think of Gaylord Nelson as one of my favorite politicians from Wisconsin who said, if I said everything I believe, I couldn't even vote for myself. And I thought, that was me, except that I said everything I believed in. And we had this extraordinary Earth Day presentation on the MSU campus in Bozeman. And then that evening, with the encouragement of some mutual friends of ours, I suddenly thought, oh, I'm not going to go to graduate school. I'm going to take a year off and indulge myself in Montana politics. And I went to the Secretary of State's office and filed for the Montana House of Representatives.
Now, Bob, you were part, other than giving him a room, obviously you were an eager participant in this thing. How did it come about for you, and how did Dorothy Eck relate to that?
Dorothy was this interesting person who showed up on campus and came into the student government office, and she'd talked to lots of people and that sort of thing. She was all excited about the environment. We didn't know what environmentalism was or what ecology was or anything like that. This was all quite new. And remember, it's Montana. She'd come from Germany and Colorado and, you know, the with it kind of places. So anyway, she persuaded me and others that this Earth Day idea was a good idea and that we needed to pay more attention to our natural environment. So I just supported her in every way I could in terms of creating this Earth Day observance, and it was very successful.
Her being Dorothy, this Dorothy.
This Dorothy,
this
yeah.
Dorothy, yeah, okay.
But Dorothy Bradley and I both knew Dorothy Eck. Dorothy Eck was a matriarch of the League of Women Voters and a very respected person there, a community leader in Bozeman. And she was interested in young people. So she talked to me and Dorothy and other young people and persuaded us that it might not be a bad idea to file for the state legislature. So Dorothy and I did on the same day. And I filed as a Republican in Flathead County, and she filed as a Democrat in Gallatin County. And it made kind of an interesting news story. Mm-hmm. And so that's how we got started in politics. And that was when there weren't single-member districts. That
Right.
came with the new Constitution that wasn't approved by the people until 1972. And just remember, this was 1970. So we both ran at large in our counties.
Countywide, yeah.
So it was possible, at least I think we both think this, that we probably likely weren't the first choice of a lot of the voters. But if they could choose, in the case of Flathead County, I believe there was a free-for-all. The Republicans nominated 5 and the Democrats nominated 5, and in Gallatin County it was 4 and 4. So when the people voted, there were 8 names on the ballot in Gallatin County and 10 in Flathead. And so the people might think, well, I'm going to vote for him and so on, these well-known names, maybe people that were in their own political party. When they get to the last choice, they think, what the heck? I'm going to give that young person a vote. You know, and that was when they could. So we could be somebody's 3rd or 4th choice and still win the election. And so it worked out.
That was political tactics, but it was driven by a desire.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We both, or at least I know we both campaigned hard. In fact, Dorothy, she was for the birds.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We forgot to bring that in.
I didn't bring my litter bag in, but I did discover along the line that this was an unusual chapter in my life. I was going to put everything off at the side and campaign on...
Only for 2 years or something.
It was going to be a 2-year hiatus.
Yeah.
And it was the most interesting hiatus I ever did. I was entranced by all the issues suddenly that were in front of me. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to ever win this election. Not someone like me, even though this is my county that I have lived in all my life. But I ran out of campaign, and I decided the only thing I can do is knock on everybody's door. And I went throughout the entire county of Gallatin, and I said, this is me, and these are the issues, and I hope you'll support me. And I actually won, and no one was more shocked than myself.
So all of a sudden, there you come. You guys are showing up, young folks, in days, this is way, way pre-term limits. So there were a lot of real senior, established legislators that had been there for a long, long time. And when you were a new kid on the block, you know, what did were you expected to be kind of quiet? But remember, it's an emerging age here. I mean, some significant things happened in 1971. You know, I mean, again, we're focusing, there's so many things you've done in your lives, by the way, in broad ranges of policy. But in terms of the term environmental or conservation or whatever we want to call it, in 1971, the Montana Environmental Policy Act was passed. That was a great, big, giant step, as was the Hard Rock Minerals Act, the Reclamation Act. Now, reclamation remembering that I want to set a little bit of the stage here, this whole series is about, after having lived for 75 years in Montana, the first 75 years as a state, with the copper collar around the whole state, being dominated completely economically, politically, and governmentally by the Anaconda Company, which got its way on everything, that we were emerging into a new age of progressivity where the people were becoming empowered. You two were kind of emblematic of that. How did it play out when it came to this type of legislation? And
I'll start on that just for a minute. Bob is the historian. He's an extraordinary historian. But one of the things, there's many things I remember about that era. I think it riveted everyone's attention that there was suddenly this sort of interesting move to the environment. I think it is so important to focus on what was happening over that first decade of the 70s, because it was very different from what had been Montana's history. Montana's history had sort of been move along, rape, pillage, move on to the next, and suddenly there is this feeling of, no, we're here for the duration. We want this place to be extraordinary for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We want to leave it as good as we possibly can. And in the 1971 to 1975-7 sessions was an extraordinary period of Montana history. And I think it was driven by this new vision among all the citizens and the legislature, of course, that we're not just thinking of being here temporarily, we're thinking of being here for the duration.
Right.
We're here forever. We are going to think of our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, and we want the system to be as productive and beautiful as it always was. And so there is this transition taking place with the legislature and who is there, who is elected, and who are the controlling powers that look over it, and also the lobbyists. Who is in there working to influence voters, who is walking through the House and the Senate chambers every day, and who is saying this is what we envision our future to be. It's just, it's such an amazing time of transition of thinking that it's hard to capsulize it, but that's what was going on.
it's interesting, Jerry Holleran, who was a newspaper reporter at the time for Lee Newspapers. Later, he became a major staff person in directing the Constitutional Convention, and he's part of our series. But Jerry, at the time in the newspapers, I read the quote and I couldn't resist it because it's to this topic. He said, and I think he was speaking of the years before this, in terms of setting the context. If environmental bills, he said, were not killed at the drop of an industrialist's hat, they often went down under the crunch of a cowboy boot. And they almost about I wouldn't call it the unholy alliance, but it certainly was an alliance of convenience with the Anaconda Company industrial complex and the Montana stock growers cadre in eastern Montana mostly, combining to represent the vested interests of Montana, which prevailed to that time. And then all of a sudden it kind of changed. Your reflections in that first year about that type of change?
Well, I think several things had a powerful impact because they came together at sort of the same time. And the era we're talking about here, from roughly 1965, maybe 1970, until the late 70s, maybe the very early 80s, you could maybe refer to as Montana's second progressive era. The first one being from the 1890s, maybe up through the administration of Joe Dixon in 1924. But you had the Anaconda Company selling their newspapers in 1959. They'd realized that they couldn't really control the public opinion in the state with newspapers anymore. Radio and television were coming in, and they saw their future perhaps more in South America actually than Montana at that point. And so they were kind of phasing out. They didn't have the powerful control perhaps they'd had before. And so that's going on, and that's an important thing that's going on. And then Dorothy's interest about Earth Day and the environment, that was creeping into the consciousness of people in Montana too. I mean, and at the Earth Day celebration in Bozeman, you know, that was an important thing, but there were people kind of beginning to think more along those lines. There was this feeling that our Constitution was totally outdated and antiquated. We had citizens boards that were appointed by the governor incrementally 1 year at a time, and some of them hadn't functioned very well for a long time, but most all of them had budgets of some kind or other. So there was a feeling that maybe we needed to draw up a new Constitution. And that was happening, you know, at the same time that these things were all kind of coming together. And I think there was a lingering resentment that was kind of bubbling to the surface about the control of politics in Montana by the Anaconda Company and increasingly perhaps by the Montana Power Company. And it just kind of exploded with the Constitution, the 1972 Constitution. Because the 71 legislature...
The very year that you were elected, 1970.
71. Yeah.
In 70 in the election,
Yeah.
the people of Montana called the convention.
Right.
And said, we want the convention. And so while you were in session in 71, all the groundwork was being laid for that special election late that year.
Right. And that, of course, got tangled up a little bit with the sales tax.
Yeah.
And the result was that there was a pretty big progressive victory in the election of the delegates to the CONCON. There were a number of independents elected to the CONCON.
6 independents, there were 59 Democrats, and the rest were Republicans. But the interesting thing was the strength of progressivity was dominant in that, not just by party, but also just by the nature of who was elected. There were a lot of people interested. Just remember, if there was any group of political people, particularly interested people, that were probably already attuned to the Anaconda Company dominance, it would be legislators. They were not allowed to run for the CONCON.
Right.
Yeah, we couldn't hold 2 offices at the same time.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a real blessing. I have to tell you that one of the things I noticed the most was, since I was the only woman in the House in 1971, in 1972, for the CONCON, almost a fifth of the 100 delegates were women. And I thought by holding out the old guard, so to speak, of which I was already one.
You became the old guard quickly?
I became the old guard very fast. There was a whole new set of people that brought a whole new kind of thinking and conciliatory work and perspective on the toughest issues of the day to being. And one of the things that Bob and I got to do, I mean, it was the great thing, since we couldn't be delegates, we got to implement the constitutional provisions. And that was very exciting in a number of ways, because the focus of environmental quality that came out of Earth Day and the whole 70s movement reflected itself very well in the Constitutional Convention.
Let me just say that,
right to a healthful environment.
Right.
Let me just say that to this day, I can't see you as the old guard. I think you're at heart a reformer, changer, improver, no matter what. So I think that's your nature.
Bless you. May I always be.
Yeah. And but all of a sudden we did have a constitution to deal with. But before that happened, again, the Hard Rock Mining Act that Harrison Fagg, and he was on one of our programs talking about what they did with the Hard Rock Mining Act in '71, and the Montana Environmental Policy Act started us in that direction in a strong way to reflecting the need for environmental quality, let's say. And I think I just want to bring up that the thing that just raised the question, what were the factors that led to this emergence? You mentioned, I mean, the Earth Day kind of sense of things, but wasn't the weakening of the Anaconda Company a big part of this?
I think they were important together. And I want to mention too here, the Montana Environmental Policy Act was a sort of a reflection of the National Environmental Policy Act. And remember, who was president at this time was Richard Nixon. And so a Republican legislator from Billings by the name of George Darrow introduced the Montana Environmental Policy Act. And it seems as though today, to me at least, many things are extremely polarized. And the Republican Party has kind of moved into a position where, you know, it's more concerned about the economy than it is about the environment. There would be Republicans who would argue about that, but it's more of the environmental protection kind of issues, if that's even a term that applies in the modern context, is a lot more divisive than it was then. then protecting the natural environment that we all lived in was something we could all pretty much agree on.
I think protecting the environment almost was I hate to use this term, but a Rockefeller Republican concept.
Or maybe even broader than that.
But keeping in mind that it was written under Richard Nixon that we got the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency.
And you mentioned the other Hard Rock Mining Act, the other bill that was Harrison Fagg, who was
Yeah.
another Republican legislator from Billings. So
it wasn't divided by party.
It wasn't.
Boy, it's
It was
nothing
actually,
like today.
It was somewhat more of a unifying issue actually then than now. It's as with many issues, a divisive issue.
Isn't it strange? I said that to a Republican friend of mine yesterday, actually, and I told him I was coming here to have a session with you guys, and we were going to talk about how both parties were united behind strengthening our protection of Montana, unlike today. And he said, no, we're not like that today. And I just kind of raised my eyebrows. I didn't have time for further discussion because if you look at it today, part of the subtext of what we're talking about is how we don't slide backwards from the kind of reforms and progressive changes that took place. It's easy to slide backwards. And part of this series is to make everyone recognize what happened, so we're aware of what if we're going to slide back, we better know what we're sliding back from, and sliding back to, which was the dominance of the Anaconda Company type of things. But gee whiz.
Well, we should relive a little of the 70s environmental legislation because it was a pretty extraordinary time. And as I have said, it was the public, I think, finally thinking, we're here to stay. We don't want to denude, we don't want to desecrate this place because we're going to be here in perpetuity. And I think the legislature was really reflecting that very well. We had this extraordinary discussion in the Montana legislature, which I think all of us who were there think was breathtaking. And that dealt with what are we going to do into the future to deal with the demands of energy, coal, electrification, thermal generating, diversion of the Yellowstone River. What are we going to do with all of that?
And we were the epicenter, supposedly because of the North Central studies that predicted 70 electric power plants in eastern Montana. And
I should go back and count, but I don't know the count at this point. I've heard any number of counts. But the North Central Power Study came out saying, here's the coal, here's the water, we're going to build thermal generating plants, we'll have slurry pipelines going out of Montana. The water came out of the Yellowstone River, the coal came out of agricultural people's pastures, out of their land, and suddenly everybody on Montana is in high alert. There was even language in the federal power study that said this part of Montana will be a national sacrifice area.
Yeah.
So we did have this period of incredibly productive time in the 70s. I introduced a moratorium bill in '73. It led to a debate that Bob can recount better than I can. I think I was so wired, I don't know if I can remember even what I heard. But I want to give credit where credit is due. Why did Montana do these incredibly thoughtful policy changes in the 70s? A lot of other states out here weren't doing it. We've talked about that a little, trying to think, why did we do that? We had a history of corporate domination. We had the Northern Plains Resource Council, to whom I give huge credit, who spread out their spokesman across the plains, across the Northern Plains. It wasn't an office in a city. It was people out there saying, this is where my cattle are. I'm worried about what's happening to me. And we had this debate in the Montana House of Representatives about whether we should postpone development for 2 years, postpone more permitting of mining, of diversions of the Yellowstone River. Should we postpone this while we think about the future that we want for Montana? But that idea came entirely from ag representatives meeting in a living room in Billings one year, thinking, you know, we're so worried about our lifestyle. Where are we going? Montana has, at least in the last 40 years, a wonderful history of activism out there in the grassroots, saying we want to have a voice in our future.
So this produced a bill to say, let's hold our breath, let's take a break for 2 years and see what's happening before we do anything more, because among other things, the fear of this massive development that looked like it was coming. What happened to that bill?
Well, it's a great story. Dorothy sort of threw the ham into the synagogue, so to speak. And it created a great furor of activity, and so we had to figure out what to do with that. And the Eastern Montana legislators, led by Jim Lucas, one of the greatest men of all time in the Montana legislature, with just a beautiful orator and a brilliant lawyer and a charming, wonderful man. And his position was that even though
he was Speaker of the House that year.
Speaker of the House of Representatives, and this was kind of overwhelming to the people in Eastern Montana. This, you know, the projection of maybe as many as 70 power plants, and you know that this area, rest of the country, would kind of consider to be a energy waste area. But at the same time, the people from Eastern Montana had remembered that the Depression in Montana didn't start in the 1930s, it started in the 1920s because of a drought in Eastern Montana and Western North Dakota. And so they hadn't had any real prosperity for decades and decades and decades. And this finally was their first big opportunity to get something going over there economically. And here's Dorothy coming in with her bill saying, let's be careful, let's look before we leap here, let's wait for a couple of years and see if we can understand how to implement this. Well, I thought it was a great idea to do that, but I mean, I didn't come from that part of the state, and those people over there, I think, were afraid that if we postponed it for a couple of years, that it may never take place, or at least it may never take place in a significant way that could really help them economically. So there was a debate on the floor of the House that's still remembered well by the people who were there, and Dorothy and I were on the floor, you know, when the debate took place. And it was essentially Jim Lucas was the guy that was arguing against the bill. He was the main guy, but there were several people the number of people that argued on the floor. Runs in my mind it was
Wasn't
an evening.
John Hall one of the big orators?
It was an evening debate.
It was an evening debate, so that kind of added to it somehow or other. But I think unexpectedly, John Hall, who you could describe like Jim Lucas in a lot of respects at least, he was brilliant and a beautiful public speaker and presented himself real well. So he stood up, and it was a kind of like the Webster-Haynes debate in the Montana legislature, you know, with Lucas being one and Hall being the other. And they were both just breathtakingly good, just really good. And what I remember about Lucas, of course, was that this is our opportunity. Why are the rest of you trying to get, you know, in trying to save us when we just want to get some jobs and get some things going in our part of the state?
Please don't save us.
Yeah, please. Yeah, I mean, perfect way to describe it. And Hall, I remember, the most memorable thing I remember about him was he had this oratorical skill of recognizing the importance of a pause, you know. So I remember him saying, "Act in haste, repent at leisure." And it was just powerful, you know, at least it was at the time. And anyway, it ended up on a tie vote. And in fact, maybe did it pass that night by one vote?
It passed by one vote,
Yeah,
and
that's right.
then, of course, it came up the next day.
And a guy changed, and then it became a tie.
You lost somebody, so before it went to third reading,
Yeah, on
tie?
second reading, it made it by one vote. Dorothy's bill passed
Right.
by one vote, and then on third reading, it was hung up on the
50-50 vote.
On a 50-50 vote, so it didn't pass, and
It's
it's
stayed
just
there.
hanging there, and it hung there like a Damoclesian sword for 2 or 3 weeks. And during that period of time, the environmental faction in the legislature was scrambling to try to do some things that would prepare us for the coal development that certainly was coming. And the idea was, if we don't have 2 years to wait, then we're going to have to make maximum use of this legislative session to get that accomplished. Well, the other side that desperately wanted to go ahead with the coal development was eager to bargain to make sure that they could get
stop
started
the
with it.
moratorium.
And so it was an incredibly productive time during that legislative session. Dorothy's bill was responsible for it. I mean, it was what forced the actions that took place during that legislative session that we now characterize as an important part of Montana's second progressive
And that
year.
was the 73
Right.
session, and that included the Strip Mine Reclamation Act passed.
Yes, there was a number of bills that passed, and I love Bob giving so much credit to the moratorium, but I think everybody was really ready to move. There was a kind of a spirit of cooperation. Let's get this stuff figured out. It's so technical and it's so complicated. I would be the first to say that those people who worked through the detail, they deserve our thanks to this day. Nothing was easy. Dick Kohlberg and Herb Hunnekens and these other people, Dick had run solely to get a reclamation bill through the legislature. He had relatives out at Sarpy Creek, and you have to understand how complicated this was for Montana. Suddenly this resource is desired, and yet the coal is the seam in the earth that's carrying the aquifer for the ranchers out there. And when you disrupt the coal and take it out, you know, you don't know what's going to happen to your water supply. And then you're going to have these power plants at Colstrip. Is it going to be a company town? Is it going to be an incorporated town? It was very tough. It was like everybody said, let's try to cooperate to figure out what our future is going to be. And the main thing I can say is, I really do think that that is the time Montana got its collective head around the situation of, we've got to think about what kind of place we want to be for the future. You know, we're not going to just be ripped off by companies who leave a big hole in the ground for copper mining. We have to think how we're going to maintain the future productivity for the future generations to come. We've got to protect the aquifer. We've got to make sure that the soil will grow grass again. We've got to make sure the air is okay to breathe. It was thoughtful, but my gosh, it was so difficult. It was very tough to get into those technical details, and I bless those people who spent their lives, they're a huge piece of their life trying to make that happen.
If you look at it, with the sword of Damocles hanging there, the Strip Mine Reclamation Act passed, the Open Cut Mine Reclamation Act passed, the Utility Siting Act, the first one, passed. In 1973, the bill was passed to make constitutional a resource indemnity trust fund.
Right.
That would take money from the development of resources, put it in a sacrosanct trust under the Constitution.
Right. But not just coal.
Not just coal.
Yeah.
And then have it, ultimately the resources go into the localities to help out with any kind of damages or any kind of effort. Now, those all happen. It seems to me in context was looking both backwards and forwards. That looking backwards, we had the history, and the poster child was Butte. Butte all the way through Anaconda down to Missoula, what is now the largest Superfund site in the nation, was evidence of degradation of uncontrolled development. And again, as the weakening of the Anaconda Company, people were taking a look and saying, is this what we want for Montana? Right. That's looking backwards, and there was real evidence that things needed to be different. Looking forward, you had a fear factor. The study about coal, there was discussion of, are we going to have 10 towns of 20,000 each, or one community of 200,000 created in eastern Montana as a result of this. That's such a massive change, and Tenneco was in buying up water rights. People were very fearful of the future in eastern Montana, and looked back at Butte development and the degradation and said, that was part of the context of saying, let's do something while we can. And the sort of Damocles, the moratorium, helped set the stage for that. The RIT, when the time came in 1974 election, passed with almost 62% of the vote in favor of it, the Resource Indemnity Trust Fund. So that's a very interesting, you guys were both players in that and observers of the process at the same time. It's interesting to look back. If we move forward to, remember the 73 session was a combined 73-74. We had annual sessions for the only time we ever did under the new Constitution. So as part of that continuum in the 74 session, the Strip Mine Siting Act occurred. So there's really significant legislation occurring at that period.
And we should not ignore George Darrow's MEPA,
right.
the Montana Environmental Policy Act, it sort of crept through a fabulous Republican. A lot of environmental legislation was carried then by Republicans like Harrison Fagg. But in essence, I thought George Darrow's MEPA reflected the idea of the moratorium, that you will have this magical moment of a brief period of time where you figure out what you're doing and where you want to go. You don't just make an overnight decision. And that's what the Environmental Policy Act did. It reflected what was going on nationally. And I know we all struggle to this day with, oh no, not another environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment. But the idea is very sound, that we weigh what we're going to do. We look at all the impacts in advance and decide if that's what we really want to do. It was a great idea, and I think it served us very well. And George Darrow was to be so commended. It was really innovative in that era.
And again, emblematic of the fact that this wasn't a major difference between parties. It was often a difference of geography.
Right.
Or a little economic interest here and there, but it wasn't a partisan issue. It was there was certainly a bipartisan flavor to this. When we went to the 75 session, one of the things that happened there was in the 75 session, we did two things. We passed a coal severance tax, which was the highest in the nation. Tom Tao, who was on a previous program with us, ended up the primary driving force, and ultimately it was his bill that was used. That there was a big argument about, well, should it be 30, should it be 40, should it be 50, should it be 15? And it ended up at 30, and that became a statutory thing. And then the legislature, you guys were both there supporting it, was put on the ballot a coal trust fund. Miles Romney introduced a bill, didn't he?
Right.
And by 75, you were in the Senate.
Right.
And Miles
was in the Senate, yeah.
Yeah, and Miles introduced the Coal Severance Trust Fund, the Coal Trust Fund, which said that if you're going to collect a bunch of money from coal taxes, 50% should go into a trust fund, which should aggregate over years and years and years and years, and the benefits thereof would derive to you're depleting your resources. Why not have something for the long term out of it? And you do that through an inviolate trust fund under the Constitution, which required a 3/4 vote of both houses to take any money out of it.
Right.
And I think it passed by 63+% when it was on the ballot. Tell us about your thoughts about the coal tax and the trust fund.
It was one of the most momentous pieces of legislation probably to pass. I don't know, maybe so far this century. And the guy who was principally responsible for it was Tom Tao, a state legislator, I think by then in the Senate too, from Billings. In fact, at the turn of the century, when in the year 2000, the newspapers in the state, I think the Lee newspapers, did a study of the 100 most significant people in Montana history in the last century, and State Senator Tao was on the list. He was something like 25th or 26th or something, actually fairly near the top of it. And it was due primarily, I think, to his sponsorship of that particular bill, although he was a wonderfully prolific state legislator and a very effective one. And so it was a major piece of legislation. And the 30% coal tax didn't remain in effect at 30% for a long time. We talked about the projection that we'd have, I didn't remember, but something like 70 of these power plants in the Northern Plains region. Well, that turned out to be somewhat of an exaggeration, I think. But, you know, maybe things could have played out so it would have happened that way, I'm not sure. But some people would argue, and by no means everyone, that the 30% coal tax that we imposed in Montana inhibited the development of coal to some extent in Montana. And it made it...
A decade later, it was reduced to 15%.
Yeah, during Governor Schwinden's administration, it was reduced a little bit. In fact, it was reduced, I think, from 15% down to 10%, so really quite a bit. But there are other factors that could have been involved in this. For one thing, the Union Pacific Railroad had a straighter shot back to the markets in the upper Midwest than we had out of Montana.
From Wyoming, yeah.
Yeah, from Wyoming to haul the coal. So that was a factor. And then also apparently the overburden, as they call it, the amount of dirt on top of the coal seams in Wyoming was
Less.
shallower than most of it is in Montana. So those were factors too. But I guess the point to make here is that there was several times as much coal being developed in Wyoming as in Montana. And that's what led eventually to the reduction of the coal tax. But that doesn't diminish the great importance of the coal tax, because at the rate we were developing it in Montana, and the way that 50% of it's gone into the coal trust that Senator Romney, who incidentally was the first cousin of George Romney, who was the presidential candidate back for a while, and I think obviously related then too to Mitt Romney, though from a different political party. But anyway, Romney's bill that established the coal trust has led to a trust for future Montanans to benefit from that now amounts to $1 billion.
This year it crosses $1 billion.
It crosses $1 billion, and so this feeling that we all had back when we started in the legislature and that was developing before we got there about how we developed all this copper in Montana and we didn't really have much to show for it. We had a big Superfund site to show for it. And so the idea was this time we're not going to let that happen. We're going to try to set aside an important part of the revenue from the coal for future generations to enjoy. And I think that's been successful.
Well,
so that was a huge piece of legislation.
Isn't it nice to be able to take and look at something that you conceptualized, you thought about it and said, okay, this is going to maybe start small, but it'll grow. And if development occurs, and if we deplete the resource somewhat, and we haven't really touched it that much, but it's still a depletion of the resource, we will have something to work with for future generations. And then to sit here now, here we are, 44 years later, well, in this case of this one, it's 40 years later, and we have $1 billion fund there that is generating interest that supports the general fund, supports water projects, sewer, bridge projects, is invested in Montana business development. I mean, what a success story to feel like you were part of that.
It's a really nice success story. It's like everybody has to fight for it every time the legislature is back in session because somebody wants to invade it. So sometimes you wonder if it's just a little bit of a curse. I mean, instead of dealing with the ongoing demands of revenue and what we have to do to fund the state and education, all the important things we do, everybody always says, oh, let's figure out a plan to go after the trust fund.
Let's go steal money out of the savings account, so to speak. Yeah.
But it was an extraordinary product of wisdom and foresight, and those who created it, I just came along with the momentum, but it was simply visionary, and
Well,
it's really
times,
remarkable.
Yeah. We're speaking of the times, and you were part of it, and you didn't have to write the bill, but to reflect on those times, I mean, I think of the forward of the person who drafted, who said, if you're going to try to take money, I mean, this is like really, I think, understanding the nature of legislation and the desire that if I can take it out of a sock of money here, a can of money in the backyard, and I don't have to have a tax, I'm better politically, so that it says 3/4 vote of each house separately to take money out of it. A damn near impossible thing to get done. That was some real thinking on someone's part. I don't know who it was. It was Francis, whether it was Miles, whether who it was, but it.
There was a lot of great thinking, and probably not enough credit is given to the many people who were thoughtful. Major facility siting was Francis Bardnose. I think it was in 1975. I mean, this is the person to whom all of us simply prayed on the altar. He was such an extraordinary leader in Montana. But I think he wanted a little piece of the action. He did so much action to modernize Montana. But when he introduced the Major Facilities Siting Act, I think by the time he introduced it, every person in the Montana House was a signatory, was in effect a co-sponsor,
Wow.
which just shows what feeling there was at that point that these are important things. This will mark our period of Montana history.
So if you're going to build one of these things, we're going to have to do it on Montana's terms. Is that the way
Montana
we look at it?
terms, that's a good way of putting it.
And so everyone signed the bill. Wow. That's pretty stunning, isn't it?
Yeah.
No one ever signed. I never had that many signatories on any bill I introduced.
You know, though, it's interesting, too, to look at some of these things because the Major Facility Siting Act, I think, is an example of some of the legislation that was enacted in the 1970s that was pretty significantly modified in the 1980s. Yep. Then the concern was, gosh, all this development's taking place down in Wyoming. They've got money for things we can't afford up here in Montana. Maybe we should make it a little easier for these plants to be sited in Montana. The coal tax, which we've already mentioned. Gee, maybe if we offered the window of opportunity as Governor Schwinden proposed, if we can entice enough more development into Montana, then the benefit to the developers would be that they'd have to pay only a 20% tax on coal instead of a 30% tax on coal. So we were frightened of the development. We wanted to be careful about it. We wanted to look into the future and protect future generations from being overwhelmed by this. But that changed within about a decade or so, not completely, but that maybe we went too far on this thing. Maybe we want to actually develop a little more coal, and now that we've got these laws in place, we can still do it on Montana terms and that sort of thing. And that's when the environment, I'm not saying that it just happened overnight during that period of time, but that's when you started to see it become more divisive than it was in the 1970s.
It is interesting. I'll make some observations as an economic development professional for 25 years, is that when we saw the coal tax go from 30, and it was what the legislature did was say, goes to 25, then to 20, then to 15, and it stayed at 15. And it created a window of opportunity, and modification of facility siting and other obstacles were a way to say, we're opening the door for this growth. And the growth didn't happen. It still has not happened. Significant growth. We are more about exporting coal than we are about actually using it in Montana to any great degree. And so the bottom line was that the promise, or I wouldn't say promise, the hope that it would somehow stimulate economic benefit with a few more plants and a few more of those things that had permanent workforce and everything else, actually hasn't panned out. And that speaks to eternal optimism and hope of people who are looking for work. As you said, in the eastern Montana, the Depression started in the 20s and almost never went away. Oil now in the Bakken is now providing a little bit of this. It reaches out and impacts eastern Montana in an interesting way. But coal itself, I think when we saw the reduction of the taxes, it was not one of those supply side things where the rate went down, we cut the rate in half, doubled the production, got the same amount of taxes. It didn't work that way. But what you do when you're doing this stuff is you do what you think's right. And in the 1970s, what was right was protecting Montana after a near century of degradation, lack of control, lack of... Now, by the way, speaking of that, you had in 1975, we had a number of things happen in 75. The trust fund was put on the ballot, but a Lakeshore Protection Act came up. It was an interesting experiment in popular politics and representation. Yeah. Now, who would have concern over a lakeshore?
Well, it might be a guy from northwestern Montana with Flathead Lake and Bitterroot Lake and Ashley Lake and Whitefish Lake, a lot of pretty
That would be a fellow named Bob Brown, I think. Would it be?
How are we fixed for time?
We've got about 6-7 minutes. But,
okay, well, I'll be brief because I'm sure Dorothy has another comment or two to make too. But it was again kind of typical of that era. I think it'd be more difficult to get past now, but in the 1970s and 1975 we were concerned about protecting our environment. And the story is that my hometown of Whitefish, there was this fellow who filed a quitclaim deed on a piece of property right near a little stream that flowed into Whitefish Lake called Lazy Creek. And after this guy got ownership of the property, he went there in the fall with a cat, a crawler tractor, and he dozed a bank down near the mouth of the stream, not realizing or not thinking about the fact that in the spring, when the water came way up, little old Lazy Creek turned into a raging torrent, and it washed all this fill plus a great deal more fill into Whitefish Lake, all the ground that he disturbed there. So the lake, that beautiful lake, was coffee colored, you know, in June and July of that summer. And the landowners around the lake came to me and said, Bob, there's got to be a way to prevent somebody from doing something like that. So several of us got together on the local level. There were, Frank Morrison was an attorney there, and a guy named Buster Schreiber was an attorney. Gene Hedman was an attorney, Charlie Abel, who managed the credit union, and myself. And we spent some time working out the details for a Lakeshore Protection Act. But we didn't want to have to go to Helena and have them enforce it on the local level. We wanted to somehow, to the greatest extent possible, to have the enforcement take place right there. And so we provided for the creation of lakeshore committees on lakes that would be made up of people who own property on the lakes and who would advise the city or the county, the local governing jurisdiction where the lake was, because in the case of Whitefish Lake, a fair amount of the lakeshore was within the city limits of Whitefish. And there were some discussions about how far back we wanted the protections to take place from the mean annual high water mark of the lake and that sort of thing. But anyway, all those details were worked out, and the bill passed, and I think it's been real successful. But then it was easier to get a concession or to get people to agree, hey, property values are involved in this. I mean, it's to everybody's benefit to have pure lake water quality, not just for health reasons, but for economic reasons. Your property's more valuable. And so you had pretty substantial people owning property around the lake who agreed that we needed to do this, and you also had people concerned from more of an environmental standpoint, you know, about the quality of the water in all the lakes in Montana. And so it was a neat bill, and it was neat to get it accomplished.
You know, I think it reflects what you said about the desire for this quality, reflects on Montanans generally, and I think I personally think the proof's in the pudding that if you look at one of the strongest attractions Montana has, first and foremost, is the tourism economy is clearly built upon a quality Montana. One that is visually attractive, pristine, that brings people in here as visitors.
Right.
But if you look at people who decide, and this has been my business for 25 years, people that decide where to put their business if they have that option, and many businesses have the option of locating where they want to, if they want to grow the economy, that the quality of life in Montana almost always comes out right at the top of the decision-making matrix of these companies. And things like taxes, you know, which everyone says is the first problem, they're way down the list. Workforce, quality of life are big attractions for Montana, and have meant a lot to developing the economy. So when Montanans decide to do it their way, to have a quality jobs and a quality environment at the same time, they're not opposite each other. They become something that works in tandem that helps develop an economy in Montana. And so we are more pristine than most places right now today. And a good deal of that is because of what was done in the 1970s. If we'd have continued down the course that we had through the first 75 years, the way it worked in the Butte Anaconda, down to Missoula, up in Great Falls on Smelter Hill, you know, our state would look a lot different than it does today because of the work you guys participate in.
So in kind of rolling in, Evan, when I think of what I might have offered the most of in my wonderful opportunities to be in the legislature, I would think maybe number one was to encourage other people to be involved. I think people saw the extraordinary opportunity that I had to talk about these issues in the state of Montana. Montana lifts people up to the top if they want to have a voice. And I think other people joined in, and a lot of young people, and I hope they still do. And I think getting them to get in the midst of the process was one of the best things I ever did. And if I ever had a thanks to give, it's all the people out at the wings who do all the extraordinary work. Every time you pass a bill, every time you make a statement, every time you develop an idea, there are 100 people out there working to help you develop these ideas who care so much about this state. And those are some of the thoughts that I leave when you give us this opportunity to express our thoughts.
Yeah, it is. Bob, your kind of reflections in a broad sense on the
Well,
period and
luck was a factor. You
Lots
know.
of luck.
Yeah, lots of luck. But we just happened to arrive at a enormously important time in modern history of Montana. I mean, the 70s, the beginning of the middle 60s, and the 70s up into the 80s were a period of time when a lot happened. And, you know, it just happened to be that we were the right age and, you know, took advantage of some opportunities. And
were
got
you
there at
two
the
the
right
first baby boomers in the legislature?
Well, probably close to it.
Yeah.
But I kind of look at it as though I had a front row seat on some stuff that happened that was important. And I used my position there to influence things as I could, you know, as things developed, and look back, and I'm extremely grateful for that opportunity.
Now here you are, the new kids on the block.
No, we're the old kids on the block.
Now we are.
You're able to reflect upon this stuff looking backwards with all this experience that you've had, and you see that in today's political environment, the stuff that was accomplished in a bipartisan way for the benefit of Montana seems to be not the methodology. I mean, we're not seeing this happening today in Montana or in the nation for that matter.
Right.
I would like your each, as we think about how we take a second progressive era and don't slide backwards on it, as to the differences between now and then, and is there anything we can do about that?
Well, I think optimism is a real important characteristic, and I've always tried to be an optimist. I'm having to struggle to be one now.
It's tough some days, but
Yeah.
we still got to stay
But
there.
you have to. It doesn't. You don't gain anything, or you don't make any progress if you grumble and complain all the time. But I guess I know we're really short for time, but I can remember as a kid in the 1950s thinking the world is constantly becoming a better place. We had the Green Revolution. So with chemicals, we were able to feed more and more of the world. And there weren't any hungry people, or at least near as many, you know, starving in India and that sort of thing. And it seemed as though as the colonies separated from the mother countries, in Africa in particular, that democracy was breaking out all over the world. And it was obviously the most enlightened form of government, and people were seeing that every place. And it seemed like the world was just becoming a better and better place. Even in the 60s and 70s, when we recognized the importance of the environment and so on, that was the case. Now, you know, if we're realistic about it, we don't see this stuff developing quite like it seemed to when we were younger.
So you've got a challenge in staying
It's more of a
optimistic.
challenge
That
now.
isn't the reality when you say you're bringing new people in is the biggest important thing you could do. I think there's a challenge today of young people not seeing it as a place of opportunity for change. And so, you know, we've got to stay at it. Guys, people like us have to stay at it, don't we, to fight the battle?
Well, it's very sad to me that one of the best things I do is encourage young people to be involved. But they have to be involved wherever they feel the energy to be involved. And I sometimes think fewer are feeling less inclined to be involved in policy making. They see the horrendous negative of the battles that we have in the state and in the country right now. All I would say is hang in there. I mean, policy is the most interesting thing you could ever be involved in. It is a gift to get to decide issues of policy. So be engaged with the people that surround you and try to understand them and share and learn from each other, because that's the only way we're going to solve it.
Well, thanks to both of you, in my mind, giants of Montana, that Montana is still high, wide, and handsome, and we'll reflect upon that in the future. And thank you for joining us in the Crucible of Change.